I love, love, love talking about propagation mediums because there's so many out there. There's so many different ways to mix them in order to customize
Oh, okay.
the medium to be what you need. Anyone that does like to cook or was into chemistry, this is the part that gets sciencey
Oh, okay. I'm interested.
because you get to mix different mediums and tinker around with what works for your individual plant. I have a whole shelf here that has just boxes and boxes and boxes of different
Wow.
substrates that each have different pHs.
Welcome to the Beet podcast. I'm your host today, Jacques, the garden hermit. And today we have Lindsay Sisti from All the Plant Babies. You just wrote a really interesting book about propagating and growing houseplants at home. But I'd love to hear a little bit about you, what you do, and your favorites.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here, Jacques. My name, again, like you said, is Lindsay. I am a houseplant and rare plant entrepreneur. Basically, I started with these rare plants and houseplants really when I was a little girl. It all started because my father was a plant collector and my mother was a scientist. So I knew from a
Oh,
very
cool.
young age that like so many of your listeners, I'm sure, that I wanted to have a life filled with plants and science, whether it be gardening, indoors or outdoors. I just knew that plants had to play a big role in my future. And it was much easier when my parents were the ones taking care of them and I was surrounded by them. But what I quickly learned as I got older and older was that I did not inherit the green thumb that my
Ooh,
parents naturally had. And so every single plant that I owned, I would kill. Every single plant. I mean, it was pretty tragic. Even my mother couldn't help but to laugh at me, and it was really sad. And so what I did was I began to research heavily. I said, if I'm not going to have this trait naturally, I have to learn it. And so I began reading book after book. I mean, I think one of my books here is The Complete Houseplant Survival Manual. I think that was written in like the
oh, nice.
90s. And one of the OG houseplant books. And I would just start taking notes and writing journals. And eventually, the internet became filled, late 90s, 2000s with plant information. And I learned through using moisture meters and well aerated soil that you can't just keep a plant in the nursery soil and expect it to thrive forever
Right.
because it's so dense, that I could keep a houseplant alive. And just as we were
Wow.
discussing before, it's a problem when you keep all your houseplants alive because then you end up with a jungle of 200, 300 plants if you're a plant addict. And that's kind of what happened to me. And from there, I started propagating all of these plants. And when you propagate 200 plants, it turns into 400 cuttings. And I love
At
to deep
least.
dive. Yeah, at least. And I am just in love with plant information and botany and horticulture. And it was a hobby and a passion of mine like no other. And so I learned how to propagate each type of plant. And then I began to sell them and post all the information on the internet, on my Instagram account. So both of those things started to flourish and grow. Sorry, I cannot help but to use words that have to do with plants to describe things in real life. But yes, everything started to grow and flourish. And from there stemmed my business. And here we are.
That's really cool. A lot of really interesting sort of familiarities for me. My mom,
Really?
growing up, always had like a super green thumb, and everything she grew, whatever, it looked like she didn't even try. Like she'd put it in a
Yeah,
random pot that doesn't even make sense, that would never work as a gardener.
right.
Even today, I'm like, how did you even do that? So, I think we could all learn our green thumbs. Maybe some people do have it from the beginning, but we could all
Yeah.
get there by working. And in a similar fashion, when I started, I also started picking up older books and just reading them and just absorbing, because I wanted to know, like, what
Right.
is going on? Like, how can I unlock this further? And it really helped me see everything all together. And that's when you really start realizing that even, you know, gardening, you could look at it as like a big scale in your yard, but even with the houseplants, there's so many connections to everything that you're interacting with, whether it's the light, the air, the watering, the soil, as you mentioned. So there's like a whole world to learn. And it sounds like he just also dove right into it and
Oh yeah.
started absorbing. So
Yeah.
that's really cool.
People people tend nowadays to just Google everything, which is
Yeah.
wonderful. And you can get even, well, now with AI, you're not even getting websites, you're getting like the AI answer up
Oh
top
my God. Yeah.
for your question, which is wild. But there's just something about reading, especially like the old school plant books or botany books or a real horticulture book that puts
Yeah.
everything in the big picture into perspective. Like you said, like how does photosynthesis work? What is plant respiration? And learning those basic scientific concepts and then being able to apply that to your garden or to how taking a cutting of your pothos works really helps you just to become a better plant parent. And for those of us
Yeah.
that maybe a green thumb didn't come naturally or that gene was not passed down to me, it helped me to and become even a greener thumb than my parents. Now they look at
Yeah.
me and say, "Oh, wow, Lindsay, we could never grow plants like that." I said, "Are you kidding me? You had it naturally. I was just trying to be like you."
Yeah.
So,
No, it's very much the same for me. It's interesting because it's almost like by gaining all this knowledge at the beginning, it allows you to become intuitive later on. Because now, like,
yes.
maybe you're not like looking up the very specifics of how this works, but you've read it, you've understood it, and now you can just
Right.
make intuitive choices as you're working on your plants or in your garden. And it really just kind of unlocks your comfort. And I think the comfort is really what also helps push your green thumb further, is when you don't
Right.
feel like you're stressing anymore and you're comfortable. But
Right.
speaking on houseplants and the propagation, one thing I've always kind of messed around with propagating plants in my garden. Like I have this huge mulberry tree in front of me, and I would try rooting it in many different ways. And, you know, it would be like, what am I doing with it? I don't know. I don't have any plan. Like, I don't have anywhere to
Right.
put it. I just
Right.
want to try different things. And so it sounds like with houseplants, there are a lot of different ways to propagate, maybe
Oh, yeah.
more than I could even think of. I don't know if I'd even naturally come to them because just
Yes.
looking at some of your stuff, like there is quite a bit. So I'd love to start talking about the propagation of houseplants. Maybe for myself, I'm like, maybe I'm an advanced gardener, quote unquote.
Mhm.
But I am an absolute beginner. I know nothing about houseplants really. So I'd love to take that perspective and take me on a journey from
Right.
beginner to advanced on plant propagation with houseplants. And if you throw names out there, throw them out there. I don't know any of the loud names. I might know some of the
Okay.
common names, but
Yes.
hit me with whatever you got.
Yes, you're like my total opposite because I want to know so much more about gardening, and when I outdoor garden, I'm always like, "What am I doing? I don't know," but I know so much about it. They really are so similar, but they are separate worlds, indoor and outdoor
Yes.
gardening. But you can definitely apply a lot of the knowledge. But when it comes, that's a great question. When it comes to indoor house plants, the basic OG method of propagating your plant is just taking a cutting, you cut the stem and you stick it in water. And that is what most
Yeah.
people think of when they propagate their plants. And for anyone who's a beginner listening to this, that's what I recommend. If you have a house plant, whatever plant it is, and you just want to experiment and see what happens, if that's the type of person you are, talking about intuitive growers, and you're just like, hey, I've got this plant, I want to see if it grows some roots. Chop the stem, throw it in some water, wait a few weeks, see what happens. Maybe it will work, maybe it won't. And that's where you start off, just by learning and cutting and putting it in water. That's the basic. However,
Yeah.
if we're getting into really learning about the different methods, there's two overarching ways to propagate a plant, and that's asexually or sexually. And what most people are going to do at home is asexual propagation. And it's called asexual because plant sex is not involved. And I'm sorry, you can
Right.
cut me off if I get too plant X-rated in this. It's hard not to talk about propagation without talking about
I
sex on
know.
this.
Hey, we've all pollinated a squash before, so.
Okay. You outdoor gardeners have gotten pretty sexy on here. Okay, good. So no plant private parts were involved when you asexually propagate a plant. And what you're doing is you're creating an exact clone of your
Mm.
plant. So you're taking the plant that you're looking at, your mother plant, whether it be your favorite pink princess philodendron or an alocasia or a Hoya, and you're saying, I want to make a little itty bitty clone of this plant. And there's a few different ways of doing this. And that's kind of what you were alluding to, I think, is that there's so many ways to do that, more than you would
Yeah.
think. And one of the most popular ways is to take a piece of plant tissue, whether it be a leaf, a petiole, a stem, and put it in a substrate, whether it be water,
Hmm.
soil, fluval stratum, perlite, and it has to be damp. And then you wait for that little piece of the plant to grow
Oh.
roots. So
So
succulents,
you're
you
saying
take the succulent
not
leaf
just the
off.
stem.
No.
Okay, so for the succulent, yeah, I've seen that where you have like just the little leaf and that the tip of it of the succulent is like where the roots come out, right?
Right. And each plant is unique in what parts of the plants you can take off. So, and it
Okay.
depends where there is tissue that will replicate and differentiate into roots. So succulents
Gotcha.
have that concentration of tissue at the tips of their leaves, but a monstera does not.
Hmm.
So a monstera, you can chop
Oh,
it
okay.
along the stem, and begonias have that type of tissue on their leaves. So you can chop up a begonia leaf, the actual leaf, and stick that in substrate, and roots will grow all along the veins.
That's wild because there's no vegetable or fruit tree that I could think of. There might be, and I just don't know, that does it that aggressively. The best analogy I could think of for the gardener is like a tomato sucker. A common thing is like the little side growth on a tomato. You could just pluck that off, throw it in a cup of water, root that, and you could clean your tomato. Or you could take that little stem of the tomato, put it in some soil, it'll root and produce more of that same tomato. So I think that's like
Right.
the classic propagation that the gardeners do is a tomato, because they're just so easy and readily
Mm.
accepting to that propagation. But it is the stem in that case. And I've never tried a leaf of anything. That for me, I'm
Yeah.
like, I wouldn't even think to try that. But it's I guess the fun thing.
Begonias are crazy, and they're so much fun to propagate. Take like a Rex begonia, and I show this more, very exact on how to do this in my book. But if you just want to get
Oh, cool.
wild, it's a Friday night, you're feeling crazy, have a few glasses of wine, get a Rex begonia leaf, and just hack it into little pieces along the vein lines. Stick it in some, perlite with water. Perlite because it's sterile. I love to work with perlite. And put a
Mm.
dome over it or in a takeout container and wait a few weeks. And it is pretty incredible to see roots growing out of the leaves, because
Yeah.
why would roots grow out of leaves? It's very odd, but
So what happens next? Like, does a stem come up or
yeah, so
like,
roots will grow out of the leaves, and then eventually a stem will come, little stems come out of the
wow,
leaves
that's
as
wild.
well. It's pretty, it's the
It
photos
sounds
are
crazy.
just beautiful, if you look up begonia
Cool.
leaf propagation. But that's just one type of asexual propagation. Another is, like you mentioned, when you're taking pups or suckers or offshoots. If you think of the spider plant makes babies
Ooh,
for you. All you have to do is remove the baby and root that baby in a glass of water, and then it will be ready to grow. So
wow.
asexual propagation is your quote unquote typical type of propagation that you would think of when making new plant babies as a houseplant owner. And the last way I should mention is that plant owners do, and this is a little bit more of an intermediate technique, I would say, is called air layering or ground
Oh,
layering.
yeah.
So that is when what it looks like is a plastic saran wrap bag, or I know you do that in gardening, right? Like a little,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
outdoor gardening. Yes. You have the cup,
Yeah.
little
There's
cup.
these like ball things that like snap together, and then you put the
Yes.
soil inside, and the roots just come out of the stem.
Yes.
And then you cut the stem, plant it like a tree.
Perfect. I like to think of it like it's like a try it before you buy it method of propagation. So like
Oh,
instead of
yeah.
chopping the plant first, which is like so scary, because for some of these rare plant collectors, these specimens are worth up to
Oh,
$1,000.
man. Yeah. The houseplant world is wild.
Yeah. So if you're cutting the top of your $1,000 specimen, I mean, it is very stressful in hopes that it roots. But if you
Yeah.
air layer it, then you're letting it grow roots in a little ball of sphagnum moss or soil with plastic wrapped around it, and then you cut it and your baby's there. So air layering
Yeah.
and ground
It's a
layering
great
is
method.
it's awesome.
Like you mentioned, especially if you're a little bit concerned, like what if this doesn't take or I can't monitor it? One of the cool things about it, like I don't know how it works for a houseplant, but for a tree, for example, I would take a section of one of the branches, I would scrape the bark down to
Ooh,
reveal the inner layer, and then I would
yes.
put soil on it, and you could literally just wrap it in saran wrap or foil or whatever, and you get it wet at the beginning. You can mist it if you have an opening, and the roots will just
Yes.
form, and you don't have to really do anything. You don't have to worry about the cutting, rotting, or anything like that. And since it's still attached to the mother plant, it's getting most of its nutrients and everything that way. So it's still able to be
Yes.
alive while rooting. So it is like a way less stressful and I guess probably a higher success rate,
Yes.
um, if I had to
100%.
guess. Yeah.
And the way you described by scraping some of the bark off is the way that you would still do it on a rubber plant or a
Oh,
fiddle leaf
right.
fig. Although it's easier to propagate a fiddle leaf fig by simply chopping the stem and sticking that stem in water or sphagnum
Oh,
moss.
okay.
Um, but if you do want to air layer it, that is the same method because they're essentially trees.
Yeah.
Um, are you in California?
I am in California and
Okay.
we have fiddle leaf, monsteras, and rubber trees. I don't know all the houseplants in my house because they're not mine. But I do know those.
Do they grow outside by you?
Um, my fiddle leaf is actually outside on our porch. That's
Amazing.
covered, so it is
Okay.
just sitting like outside, not in direct light or directly exposed. The rubber tree and the monstera are inside, but I know I've seen them outside as well. I've seen rubber trees here that are like trees.
Yes. It's incredible.
It's yeah, it's really interesting that houseplants are like you would think that they'd be a small thing in nature,
Yeah.
but
they're
they're some of them are insane. Like they're massive. Like monsteras can climb
Yes.
all the way up a huge tree. So
Yes.
it's pretty wild how flexible these plants are that we're able to
Yes.
like tame them in our homes.
Yes, you forget, and especially, someone like me who always grew up outside of a city, and I started collecting these plants as house plants. And you sort of get into your own frame of mind and you think, oh, these are all small plants that maybe, like you said, stay small in nature. And then you go out to where they're from and you're like, no, these are trees and large scale vines that we've domesticated and turned into these tiny plants. So that's why I asked where you're from, because I don't know if I'm speaking to someone who is living next to giant ficuses, in his backyard. So,
There are a lot of giant ficuses in San Diego. They definitely are
oh,
happy here, and they
yes.
like to break up the sidewalks here as well. So
Oh
it's
my
pretty
gosh.
crazy. Like this ficus roots are some of the most wild roots. They tear up our
Wow.
sidewalks, but perfect little houseplant.
I
Doesn't break
can't
its pot or
imagine.
anything. Uh,
Yes. So you could air layer those plants.
yeah, I guess I could. Yeah, I could go out there and probably air layer a street tree. So they definitely do thrive out there. Um,
Definitely.
And for like a beginner, it seems like pothos is the one that I see the most, and it also seems to be like the easiest to propagate in water Yeah, we have one that's just growing in a cup of water, basically. I don't know how. It just lives
Yeah.
on water. It doesn't have
Yes.
anything else but light and water. Just like it's like 10 feet long. I just don't understand it. Sometimes I'm like, man, can I just grow a 10-foot long tomato in a cup of water? I don't think so.
Oh my gosh. If
Um,
every plant was like a pothos, we would just be so much better off. But then we wouldn't
we'd
have
be
the
covered in plants.
challenge. We
Yeah.
wouldn't be here because we wouldn't be obsessing all day over pothos. It would be too boring.
Yeah.
But they really are kind of like the beginner's go-to for propagation. It's the first plant actually that I detail in my book because of this.
Oh, okay.
If
Yeah.
you want to start somewhere with houseplant propagation, find either a trailing philodendron or a pothos. They more or less look identical depending on what species of philodendron you get. But
Yeah.
your standard green pothos that's trailing on a vine, you can chop it between two nodes. So the node is where for anyone who doesn't know, is where the tissue is, where
Mm.
the roots are going to grow out of. So
Yeah, that's
between the
also
two
usually where a
nodes.
leaf is, right?
Yes, yes. The leaf is right near the node, right near the node.
Right.
And you want to chop in the internode, which is the space between the two nodes, which is just that bare piece of stem.
Yeah.
And you just chop along that node and chop along the internode and stick it in water and let it grow roots. And that is like the OG method of propagation. And a really cool fun fact about pothos and propagation is, this is kind of a houseplant propagation hack, is if you stick a pothos in with one of your houseplant propagations, it will actually, not by much, but it will increase the rate that your other plant roots.
Mm.
And the reason why is because pothos root really fast. And when houseplants
Right.
are rooting in water, they emit a natural rooting hormone. And so that
Okay.
natural rooting hormone that the pothos will emit in the water will help the other plant to take root faster.
Interesting. That's cool. And you always have plenty of pothos usually. So you
So
can
you can
always
just stick one
throw it
in
in.
all of your propagations.
Yeah, that's actually really neat. I wonder if that could even help with my garden plants. I could put some pothos, get some pothos water ready, and see if that helps increase like my fig cuttings, for
You
example.
could.
So that'd be interesting to mess around with, actually.
Your wife might not be happy when she's like, "Where's my pothos?"
Like, don't worry about it. We have figs now. You could eat those. What are some other like easy houseplants for people to start messing around with? And especially if they want to get into like factory propagation production for fun.
Factory. That's pretty much what it is in my
Because it is
house
kind of
now. It's
fun. Yeah.
a
You have to
factory
keep adding
property.
shelves because you just keep getting more and more plants and you're running out of other space.
Yes, yes, it is a problem. My entire counter and the little shelf above our sink in the kitchen's filled with propagations. So the other plant that I recommend to every single person, not just beginners, because they are just incredible to work with, are Hoyas. I don't
Oh,
know.
okay.
Do you have any Hoyas, or does your wife have any Hoyas?
We do have Hoyas, yes.
Okay.
And sometimes I could picture them, and sometimes I think I'm picturing the wrong thing. But I definitely know we have them. I
Well,
definitely know we have them.
it's possible you're picturing a Hoya no matter what, because they're very diverse in the way that they look. I mean, there's Hoyas that look like just almost like a spiky grass, although Hoya
Oh.
spartioides, but most of the Hoyas look like trailing vines, and their leaves are thick and succulent-like, most of
Oh,
them.
okay.
And
Yes.
that's what makes them so incredible, because they are tropical plants that hold water in their leaves like succulents. So they don't need that bright desert sun that not everybody has, especially people
Mm,
in the gloomy Midwest like me outside Chicago.
interesting.
So
Yeah.
they do well in a lower light environment. So that's a problem with people growing houseplants. They don't have bright light all the time. So Hoyas is a great choice, not for low light, but less light than a
Okay.
succulent would need. And if you go away on vacation for a week or two, they are very forgiving of drought because they store water in their leaves.
Right.
And most
That's cool.
tropicals are not that forgiving. And the other benefit of a Hoya is that they flower and their blooms are so fragrant and so beautiful. But from a propagation standpoint, they are so simple. It's similar to the pothos in that you can just chop the stem, stick it in water. Although I keep mentioning water when I don't propagate in water all that often. Although behind me, listeners can't see, but I have tons of propagations, Hoyas in water
Yeah, you do.
actually, because they do make for beautiful glass vases and decorations. When I'm very serious about propagating, I do propagate often in some other mediums, and we can get into that. But
Yeah.
Hoyas, in general, are just simple, easy, and very diverse of a genus. You're just going to get, big leaves that look like anthuriums that have lots of veins on them to small little tiny vines. There's one Hoya that flowers and the bloom is as big as my pinky fingernail. They're awesome. I'm a little
I
obsessed,
just
if you
looked
can't
it
tell.
up to double check. Yeah. And I was like, oh, now I know I'm confused because all of these are Hoyas and they all look a little different. Uh,
Yes. Yes.
but I have seen ours has bloomed, those like little cute star blooms, and they look like
Yes.
fake little ceramic things that somebody made as a little
Yes.
decoration, and they are very cool.
Exactly.
So it was very fun to see that flowering.
And their
But yeah,
nectar tastes really good.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't
Fun
think to
fact.
even try it, but yeah,
Yeah.
it looked like it produced a lot because they look kind of like almost dewy.
Yes.
Um, so that's really neat. But yeah, let's talk about other options besides water. What are some of those other mediums that you like to actually reach for? And why would you choose one over the other, I guess?
Sure. I know I kind of led right into that because I really, because I felt bad. I'm thinking, gosh, I keep talking about water, but water's not even my thing. I love, love, love talking about propagation mediums because there's so many out there and there's so many different ways to mix them in order to customize
Oh, okay.
the medium to be what you need. And this is, if for anyone out there that, well, I would say likes to cook, although I do not cook, but anyone that does like to cook or was into chemistry, this is the part that gets sciencey because you get to
Oh, okay.
mix
I'm
different
interested.
mediums and tinker around with what works for your individual plant. I have a whole shelf here that has just boxes and boxes and boxes of different
Wow.
substrates that each have different pHs and um, it's
Oh,
really
wow. So
cool.
you get down to the pH level when you're
Yeah.
thinking about actually rooting and propagating. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
that I've never gone that deep. I've done different sort of substrates and stuff, but I've never even thought about pH for rooting,
yeah,
but it totally makes sense for certain
right.
things.
Right. Well, aeroids in general do best in a pH between 5.5 and 6.5. So,
Okay, so on the
and
acidic
I,
side.
right. And honestly, I never thought about pH much until I got very into growing anthuriums. Anthuriums are very
Mm,
finicky. And when you're aiming for perfection in growing anthuriums, you want a plant that doesn't have a lot of yellow spots on it or crispy edges. And that happens often
I
when
see.
nutrient uptake is not ideal. And the reason why nutrient uptake is not ideal is because a lot of times people are using just typical or regular water from the tap, and that's going to be a higher pH.
Oh, right.
And
It's probably
so,
gonna be more neutral, like 7.
right.
Okay.
Right. And their
That
medium
makes a lot
might
of
be a
sense.
really high pH. So that's where anthurium growers get really technical with that. But with propagation, pH is not so much of a big deal, but it's good to note that you want things to be more neutral. You want things to be more
Just in
neutral, but
general.
Hoyas, you don't have to worry about pH. I'm telling you, Hoyas are just great.
They just wanna grow.
Just go for Hoyas. They want to do life for you. They want to grow.
Yeah.
They want to bloom for you. Anthuriums, not so much, but high risk, high reward. If
Yeah,
you
and
want
those
to
are one
ask
of
me
your
what my
favorites, right?
right. I mean, growing them is truly an art form. So if you want type of person that likes a challenge and wants to rip their hair out for fun, I'm like anthuriums, but also like it's a giant science experiment every day. That's what growing an anthurium is,
Okay.
and I love to hate it, and I love it. But back to substrates. Back to substrates. So that was a wild tangent. I'm from New Jersey originally, and I could talk forever. So you got to rein me in here. So
I'm here for tangents. Don't worry.
right. Okay. So substrates. The best substrates that you can ideally propagate in have they're well draining. You want something that's well
Okay.
draining. So you don't want ideally something that's very thick and not porous and is going to be like a brown cake. Just like straight up peat moss is not ideal. It's not going to be aerated enough for some of these delicate tropical plant cuttings.
Right. Because they're not necessarily living in like deep, like compacted soil, right? They're more like
Right.
barky or on a
Yes.
tree, like not even in soil necessarily.
Right. Take into account of where these plants are growing in the first place. And second of all, you do need something that is moisture retaining. So
Yeah.
you need it to have air, air between each oxygen molecules, between each particle of substrate. You need it to be moisture retaining and ideally sterile. So
Okay.
outdoor gardeners use like topsoil and gardening soil a lot, and that is not sterile. At least I don't believe it's sterile because you have compost and other
No.
microorganisms, right, mixed in.
Yeah,
And
they
that,
usually will even add it.
right, which is great for the
Yeah,
vegetables, but not when you're propagating and you have an open wound on the plant.
that makes
So,
sense. Yeah.
right, you want something that's sterile. And indoor potting soil, and that's why I always stress to people to make sure you're using indoor potting soil only. Like it
Mm,
has to be indoor. Don't use outdoor soil for
because
your
they
indoor
literally will
plants.
sterilize it
Yeah,
instead. Like there's a
typically
difference in how they prepare. Oh,
there's a
okay.
difference. There's a difference.
That's cool. That's good to know.
Some indoor potting soil is not sterilized fully, or they'll sterilize it and then they'll add in some beneficial
I see.
microorganisms,
Right. After the fact.
but it is different and typically doesn't have compost in it, or if it does, like Fox Farm ocean soil has like ocean compost in it, but
Yeah,
they they mix around with it. But there
totally.
are a lot of aroid growers, aroids being philodendrons, monsteras, um,
Mm.
and anthuriums. They use a completely soilless mix, and they want it to be pretty much as sterile as possible. So when you're propagating, go for something that is sterile in an ideal world. So that's why a lot of people will propagate with sterilized sphagnum moss. Like New
Okay.
Zealand sphagnum moss is very, very popular for propagation. Uh, Keeping it damp, you take your sphagnum moss, you dampen it fully. People say, how moist should it be? Um, I always say, soak it and then wring it out like a sponge. And that's how
I see.
moist the sphagnum moss should be.
Like
You
barely gonna drop out.
Right. And if it's a little bit more, you don't have to like really squeeze it, but
Okay.
it's around that level of moisture. And
Okay.
you could fill a jar with sphagnum moss and stick a cutting in there. And then the roots will grow
Okay.
just as if it was in water. So
Oh, I see. So that's if you're going pure sphagnum for like
pure
rooting.
sphagnum, pure
Okay.
sphagnum. And then there are other propagation mediums like cocoa coir, like the cocoa chips.
Right.
And that's
Yeah. Oh,
coconut.
the chunkier ones.
Yep, that's really chunky. People grow, especially Hoyas, will propagate Hoyas in that. That's very, very
Oh,
coarse.
okay.
I mean, for
Yeah.
people who are listening, that sounds like, I mean, they look like just chunks of wood, essentially.
Yeah. It's almost like Cheez-Its or something, but thicker.
Very absorbent,
Trying to think of something.
spongy Cheez-Its.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean that's like really, really, really. Now you're making me
Yeah.
hungry. But yeah, it's like super, super coarse, and definitely not like water at all. But the key, if you're going to propagate in a medium that's so coarse, is that you need close to 100% humidity. So you have to use
Oh, okay.
like a propagation box
So it
and
should be enclosed, whatever you
totally
use.
enclosed. Totally enclosed. So you take, you cut up your monstera into little pieces, even little nodes, so little pieces of stem, and you throw them into a clear plastic box. And on the bottom, you'll lay maybe 3 inches of damp sphagnum moss. And
Oh,
you'll
okay.
throw the pieces of stem on top, maybe not throw, gently lay. I don't know, maybe you're a little aggressive with it. And you lay the pieces of the stem on top of the sphagnum moss, and then you close the lid. It will be 100% humidity because
Right.
it's damp
There's
in
nowhere for it
there.
to go.
Put it in a bright, indirect light space, and in a few months, you'll have baby plants sprouting. So
Wow, that's cool.
yeah, that's kind of like the best way to propagate philodendrons and monsteras, because just from one vine, you can make 10, 20 plants. But I know maybe this is rambling, but
There's a
I
lot.
really want to tell you about
No,
my favorite propagation medium in the whole world. Okay, this is very
yeah,
special.
I'm ready.
Okay. It's called Fluval Stratum. Have you heard of it?
No, but fluval is like river, right? Or moving water, something like that.
I don't
I've never heard
know.
of those though. But I know fluvial means something about like water moving. So
Oh,
my guess is it's like river bottom, like little rocks and stuff would be my
you
guess.
are good. You are
But also I
good.
was a geology major, so
Oh, damn, that's
those
why.
words
All right.
are right up in there for me. So stratum is like a layer, and then fluval is like a water deposited layer. So it's probably like a lot of little fine pebbles and things. It would
It
be my
pays
guess.
to go to school, kids. Look at this. He knows, I don't even have to tell him what it is, and he knows what it is. Yeah, so fluval stratum, I guess a geologist must have come up with that name, is
Yeah, sounds like it.
or maybe Jacques came up with the name.
I've been moonlighting in the houseplant world.
Yes. He secretly works for this company, and it's compressed volcanic rock, and it looks like
Oh,
caviar. And they use it on the bottom of
interesting.
fish tanks.
Oh, okay, yeah, totally.
Yeah, and it looks like black caviar, and it comes from, this is the weirdest part to me. It comes from one volcano in Japan. Only one. The
Ah,
Mount Aso volcano. And I'm determined to go there one day with like just a bucket to
I could tell
scoop
you
up.
my theory as to why.
Why?
Uh, it's probably because the rock that is from that volcano is very high in silica, like quartz stuff, and it
Mm,
probably doesn't have any harmful things that could leach into the water, which is why they specifically use that one for like fish
right.
tanks. Because my partner has an aquarium, and I was like, "Can you use any rock?" She's like, "No, it has to be like specific rocks that are inert, that don't like leach any minerals or anything dangerous for like the fish or plants." So it's probably just like some sort of really glassy, fine-grained rock that just simply doesn't leach into the water. So that would be my guess. But that's crazy
Yeah.
that you use that for propagation because I would imagine it doesn't hold water the same way. It just kind of like, do you let it sit in water or do you just get it wet? How does it work?
So it's interesting because it's not a rock. Well, it's considered soil. It's compressed soil. So it's very, you can actually smush it very easily. It's not
Oh,
a
weird.
rock. So they're just compressed little balls of black soil, almost like a soot.
Wow.
Yeah, so never spill it on your carpet, because if you try to clean it up, it just turns into like a charcoal. But
Yeah.
it is like crack for plants, for propagation.
Whoa.
Okay, for a few reasons. So when you propagate with it or even grow plants in it, you can use it a number of ways. First, you can use it traditionally, like just put it in a cup and put your cutting in there, your
Oh,
unrooted
okay.
piece of stem, and just water it normally, even with or without a drainage hole. And it does retain some moisture because it is soil. And I've never seen plants grow in a medium like it does in Fluval. Nobody has. Everyone is in the houseplant world. I shouldn't say everyone, but a lot of collectors use this now because we're all
Wow.
amazed. There's a lot of oxygen between each molecule, which helps with plant
Yeah.
respiration. And the pH, going back to pH, is between 6 and 6.5, and it has the
Oh,
ability to
okay.
change the pH of the water around it. So it even makes the water the
Huh.
ideal pH, which no other substrate really does. And so
Yeah.
the roots
So
will
it must
grow
be something that
faster.
dissolves.
Yeah.
Huh.
And it has minerals
That's
in it.
cool.
So people
Yeah.
aren't even using a lot of fertilizer with it.
Wow,
I
that's
did a bunch
fascinating.
of experiments to see, like, okay, is this all talk? Because you just buy it at the pet store.
Yeah.
All of my anthurium seeds and my alocasia corms, which are like the little Hershey Kiss nuggets that you'll find, like
Yeah.
bulbs that you'll find underneath alocasias, take off like triple as fast and grow twice as huge using this stuff
Wow. That's
than
cool.
with traditional like peat moss and perlite mixed.
Huh.
So I am like a mega
That's really
fan.
cool.
It
Yeah.
is.
That's interesting. I'm gonna actually look into that a little bit because I'm curious if I could mess around with that too.
You
Um,
totally could.
wow.
You totally could.
Never
But
would have
it's
thought about that.
expensive.
Yeah.
It's expensive. So what I do now
Right.
is
For propagating though, it
I cut it
can be worth it, right?
50-50 now with perlite.
Oh, okay. And that works out well. Do you ever use vermiculite?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned vermiculite. And um, I wonder where vermiculite has gone. And it's and the reason why I say the reason why I wonder what happened to vermiculite is because when I started off in houseplants and researching, all of the old message boards for houseplants would recommend, and they were message boards. I mean, this was like indoor gardeners from like the 90s on message boards. Everyone would mention propagating plants in vermiculite. So I started
Mm.
off propagating houseplants in vermiculite. But as I became more of a member of the modern day plant communities and Facebook groups became a thing. So, I mean,
You're
in the
right.
houseplant world, Facebook groups are everything, everything. Nobody used vermiculite, not a single soul. I mean, maybe someone sprinkles it in with Fluval and leca and something else, to make a mix. But I mean, it's never mentioned. I mean, actually, never.
Huh.
So slowly, I started to think, gosh, am I like the loser around here with am I like not on trend with vermiculite? No, it did. I'm like, what's going on? So my little bag of vermiculite, that it did work, and it works well, and it works just as well as I'd say perlite, and it's sterile and it has some traces of nutrients. I just stopped using it, and not for any particular reason. It just isn't used a lot
It's common
anymore.
still. Yeah, it's like you still see it in the gardening world. The one thing my one theory would be that some vermiculite has asbestos. So
Oh,
maybe people
maybe
stopped
that's
because of that. And it's like
okay.
if you're inside working with houseplants and it's dry and it could become like an aerosolized powder,
Oh
that might be a
gosh.
concern. But if you're like outside putting it into your soil that's like wet and underground, it's
Right.
probably not a big deal at all. And some vermiculite doesn't have it. Some say
Ooh,
like asbestos free on the bag. So
right.
the ones that don't say that, I would
Uh,
say you could assume that it probably does have it. So that would be my guess, and maybe that's a pretty good reason to stop using it, even
That's
if
a
it does work
great
well.
reason. That's a
So,
great reason, but I haven't even seen that. I don't see even it's almost like people don't know it exists.
yeah,
Like no one mentions it.
I
But
think it's just
uh,
less available too. Yeah,
right, I think it's less available, and I think just as newer mediums have become popular, in the houseplant world too, a lot of times people are looking for like the newest
right.
experiment and newest thing to play with. And vermiculite has been around for so long. And also, it's a little messy, especially
Hmm.
indoors, because it's so
Yeah,
flaky and light. People
yeah.
started using leca, lightweight expanded clay aggregate. I'm not sure if you use
Okay,
that
yeah. I've seen
a lot.
those. I've never used it, but I know of it. I know it's used in like hydroponics a lot.
Yes,
Um,
people
but that's
propagate with
so
that.
Okay. Yeah, it makes
Uh,
sense. So the basic propagation ingredient kit is peat is a big one.
yes.
Um, Perlite is a big one.
Yes.
Fluval stratum, if
Mm-hmm.
you, especially if you have like really nice cuttings that are
Yes.
expensive, that makes a lot
Yeah.
of sense. And
100%.
then coconut core, are
And
kind of like
sphagnum
the big
moss.
four. Oh, it's sphagnum moss. Okay. Oh, right, because that's like the chunkier stuff, right? Um,
Fluffy.
I I think of like peat moss. It's different than sphagnum moss. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then do you ever use sand? Is that something that I don't I don't think that would really be used, right? For like houseplants? It's like
You
too
know,
dense or something.
no, and especially for succulents, it's great. And it's funny. I know a guy that uses horticultural sand, and his Hoyas do
Yeah,
great in it. But again, I think houseplant people are also looking for things that aren't so messy in their homes, and sand is
I see.
definitely one of them. Uh, that would be one of those.
Uh,
But yeah, it's just not used a lot, not used as
okay.
much in favor of those
If other
other
things work,
ingredients.
yeah, then why bother? And then
Right.
having like a nice way to enclose it, like maybe a plastic bin or something like that. And with
Yes.
those things, or even just a cup of water to get started, you could propagate
Yes.
many houseplants. You could get them from your
Yes.
friends, family houses, take a little cutting. You could ask
Right.
them, but you also can sneak one maybe. But sounds
Exactly.
like a fun way to get into it because propagating is always really exciting when you get it to succeed and you see the roots and it's really fun. So let's bring it home for somebody who just rooted something in like let's say water because if you're already rooting it in something like perlite or a soil based thing, it's pretty straightforward. The roots are attached to the soil. But what do you
Right.
do? Like, let's say you put your Hoya and it rooted, and now you have a bunch of roots and water. How do I now get that into a pot and growing as a house plant?
Oh, that's that's a great question because a lot of people will root something in water and they say, "Oh, great, this is done." And then they'll put it right into a soil mix or just straight up soil from a bag and then it rots. And I think a lot of us have had that experience and it's pretty depressing because you just spend all this time or all these months rooting it and it's like what happened and people
Yeah, it's that
blame.
scary period
Right,
where you're
right, the
transitioning it.
transition period. The transition period. So, it depends on the plant. You don't always need to have a strict transition period. However, it's good to note that when plants propagate in water, they are growing roots that a lot of houseplant enthusiasts call, this is not official term, but they call water roots. And
Okay.
yeah, so you might have you heard that term before, water roots?
I feel like I might have, yeah. So they're more
You know,
adapted to growing in the water is the idea.
exactly, exactly. And
Okay.
it's a debated term on Reddit and the internet, and people get it's a heated topic in the plant
Oh
world.
yeah, I believe it.
Uh, it's funny, plant people are so peaceful, but there's certain topics that really get people
Oh yeah.
triggered and
Oh yeah.
fired
Tomato
up.
pruning is one.
Really, so
Oh yeah, don't
funny.
get people started.
Oh my gosh, it cracks me up when like gardeners get real angry.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I live for that stuff. So it really triggers people this argument over water roots and if they are a thing, but they are physically and biologically speaking a thing that the roots that plants are growing inside of water are physically different than those roots that will grow in soil.
Sure. Makes
The
sense.
Yes, they look different, they feel different. And so when that plant then goes into potting soil, indoor potting soil, which can be very dense and not as much oxygen, you have microbes in there. It, the roots are just not well adapted, and the plant can go into shock and crash. And if it's a sensitive, very sensitive plant, like say a Monstera albo, a lot of people try to root variegated Monsteras. This is like the classic case of this happening.
Oh, okay.
Variegated Monsteras root really well in water, so a lot of people do that, and then they'll pot it up and it crashes. Um, so, a great way to avoid this from happening is to have a transition period where before you just put it into soil or even your aeroid mix, out into your room or whatever humidity you were going to put it in, that you have maybe even a month, maybe a week, but some period of time where you move that water cutting into a very, very well aerated mix, or even something sterile that is physically tangible or physically hard, like cocoa coir or
Those
pine
chips.
bark. It's very chunky.
Okay.
So
Right.
the roots have some time to grow into something that is more hard and physical instead of just water.
So you just missed it?
So what I would do is put it in, and this is getting a little more technical, but I would put it in a tray of water on the bottom so it
Okay.
absorbs the water from the bottom, but definitely
Okay.
soak it
Yeah.
from the top. Soak it from the top as well. But that's kind of semi-hydroponic growing, is to put it in a little tray of water and allow it to soak up water from the
Right.
bottom. But alternatively, just put it in the soil that you want to put it in, but keep it in 100% humidity in a box for like a
Oh,
couple weeks
interesting.
to help it completely acclimate to its
Okay.
new soil, because you don't want to shock it in multiple ways. So when moving it from from water into soil, it's just going to be under shock. And so you want to bathe it with humidity from the outside to give that cutting as much TLC as you can while the roots
Okay.
are shifting, because the roots are going to be changing a little bit in form.
Yeah.
And so you could do that either through the substrate, being like switch
Huh.
to sphagnum moss first before soil, or switching it to its final destination, but putting it in a prop box, or both.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I don't know why, but my initial intuition would have been to pot it, but then make sure not to water it very much at the beginning so that you wouldn't rot it. But you are changing it from 100% humidity since it's in a cup of water. So keeping it at that 100% humidity, but also having the medium for those roots to grow in makes a lot of sense to me.
Right, right. And keeping an eye on the water too. Like you don't want to don't want to water it every day, and as we know as houseplant people, overwatering isn't so much how much water there is, but how often you're saturating it. You want to give it some time um, to dry a little bit, or if it's in 100% humidity, it's going to stay moist anyway. So
Yeah, that
it's
makes a
just
lot of
more
sense.
about, right. So it's about keeping the air around it 100% humidity to support the leaves while the roots are changing. So that
Gotcha.
incubator time period is going to just give it the
Yeah.
support it needs.
Actually, I'm curious if you've ever tried this. What I've done with water cuttings on plants, like I propagated some Thai basil earlier. And what I did is
Mhm.
I waited until I saw just a little bit of roots and then I immediately potted it up. And I felt like by
Nice.
doing that, I'm also like shorting that time period of adaptation because now I see the
Mm.
roots, so I know that roots are on their way, but they're not like fully developed water roots that have to then like deal with the change as much. And I feel like when I do
Oh.
that immediate transfer, like when I first see the roots, my success rates tend to be higher. But I don't know
Ooh,
if
that's really
that's
interesting.
something to try for houseplants or if you have tried it. But that's worked well for me in the past.
Ooh, I
So
like
yeah,
it. That could be in like
yeah,
Propagation 2.0 book. I'll do some
there you go.
experiments with
Yeah,
that.
we haven't actually introduced your book yet, and I just realized I don't think we actually said that's title. So let's roll it out for everyone. What's
Okay,
the the book? Where can they find it? And what
perfect.
can they learn from it?
Awesome. So my book is called The Ultimate Guide to Houseplant Propagation, and it just came out through Cool Springs Press. And what you
Oh,
can
cool.
find in it is essentially everything we spoke about in this podcast. I I wrote, and more, much more. It's an extremely comprehensive book designed for beginning houseplant propagators to advanced pollinators, so advanced houseplant enthusiasts that want to learn step by step how to pollinate anthuriums and other
Oh,
houseplants,
very cool.
to create their own houseplant babies from scratch. So it's really designed for anyone who wants an in-depth view on the biology, the botany, the horticulture, and the actual day-to-day experience and hands-on practice of propagating houseplants. And I made it knowing that it had to compete against social media. It had to compete with YouTube. I know you're a
So, yeah.
YouTuber, and I know how exciting your show is because I did watch it. So, books these days have to have bright colors and good pictures and lots of diagrams and some
Yeah.
ridiculous jokes, although they made me take out all perverted jokes, which I was really disappointed about because it's a sex plant book, right? And
Yeah.
I am known to make really funny perverted jokes. So no perverted jokes, but there's a lot of corny knock-knock jokes.
But if you want that, go
And
to your Instagram.
yeah, go to my Instagram for all the sex jokes about plant pollination. Yes, but seriously, this book is meant to be exciting and funny and user-friendly.
That's awesome. So if you want to learn about propagating, and even we didn't even talk about this much, but you also do some breeding, growing from seed
Yeah.
for houseplants would be super fun to learn about. So all that's really exciting. And again, the name of the book is The Ultimate Guide to Houseplant Propagation. And Lindsay from All the Plant Babies on Instagram, if you want to see some of that. And we had a very
Yes,
lovely conversation about propagation. We both learned some things maybe along the way. And I'm going to experiment
definitely.
with some of that Fluval Stratum for sure.
Yes.
It's been really fun chatting with you and learning about these houseplants. Maybe I could start, I don't know if I'm allowed to since I have the outdoor domain, but maybe I'll start messing around a little bit with the indoor plants as well. But that'll
She's
probably
going to
get
be
me in
like, back
trouble.
off my
But
plants.
yeah, she's like, you got your garden, okay, buddy? But it's been lovely chatting with you, Lindsay.
Me too.
And yeah, looking forward to learning more about houseplants. And
Yeah,
so
thank
maybe
you
we'll chat
so
again.
much for having me.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.